Hi, my name is Judy Van Koyman, and you're watching Life Issues. December's show is about Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance, and my guest is Joe Finn, President and Executive Director. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Judy. It's great to be here.
Thank you, I appreciate it. And Joe, I'm going to start. How long have you been with MASA?
I've been with the Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance, believe it or not, just this past month, or 19 years.
Wow.
I've been there since 2003.
Yeah.
So it's been quite a while.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah.
All right. And prior to joining the Mass Housing and Shelter Alliance, what was your professional background?
Well, again, I've always been pretty much, my whole professional life has been involved with homelessness. I first started working out at the Woods Mullen shelter. I was with what was then called the Long Island Shelter System. And eventually I wound up in 1990, I think it was, at Father Bill's Place. I was the executive director of Father Bill's Place. It used to be known as Quincy Interfaith Sheltering Coalition. And I did some good stuff there, and of course moved into Quincy, which is now my home. And then after that, I took over an organization that was called back Shelter Inc. And Shelter Inc. was an interesting organization. It was the second oldest, what I'd call modern homeless agency in Massachusetts. It created one of the first family shelters, the Boston Family Shelter. So it'd been around for quite a bit. It's now called Heading Home, as Quincy Interfaith Sheltering Coalition is now Father Bill's mainspring. And I often joke, I say, I don't know what it is about these organizations that they want to change their name after I leave. But again, so I've been wrapped up in this whole issue for most of my professional life. Interestingly enough, though, from 1990 right to the present moment, I had been involved with MAHASA. It was first the Greater Boston Adult Shelter Alliance, and later, became the Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance. But I'd always really liked it because it wasn't a trade association. It was really looking at the systems and causes of homelessness, and I really was always attracted to that. So I was a member, and for many years I served on their board, and then finally came in as the executive director and president.
Okay,
So,
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, moved right up.
Well,
up
I don't know if it's moved up, but it's allowed me to stay right in the middle of this issue of homelessness, which is, in my mind, one of our most pressing concerns.
Definitely. And how old is Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance?
The Massachusetts, this is where you're going to show you how bad I am at math, but it was started in 1988 and it was incorporated in 1990. And it really started out as the Greater Boston Adult Shelter Alliance. And it was really only 22 Greater Boston shelter agencies, roughly, that were involved in it. Some of the early founders were Pine Street, St. Francis House, Father Bill's. It was Father Bill's, just Father Bill's at that time. And some of those particular organizations, today, it has over 100 member agencies statewide, if you can believe that. It's a sign in some respects that's not necessarily positive in the fact that it's indicative of how much homelessness pervades our system and our service system today. But it's been around for quite a while, unfortunately, I'd say.
And Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance does a lot for homeless. Do you think there will always be an issue with homelessness, or do you see it getting better?
I'd like to say I see it getting better right at the moment, but unfortunately I don't. And let me explain what I mean by this. From about 2007 to 2015, we had significantly reduced the so-called chronic homeless population in the unduplicated count that HUD requires every year from 3,000 down to 1,100. But from 2015 to the present, that number has stayed pretty balanced. But what I'm seeing now from Pittsfield all the way to the Cape, every city, we're seeing encampments growing of people who are actually living outside. And one of the things that we know here in Massachusetts, we just don't have sufficient housing. So at the present moment, I don't see it getting better. I see it getting worse. And with the cost of housing, unfortunately, we're seeing a very new phenomenon, which is what I refer to as the new elder homeless. And what that is, it's a person who's usually over the age of 50 who is experiencing homelessness for the very first time, and has no serious disability or different things like that. It's usually purely socioeconomic. They can no longer afford the room they're living in. They've lost their jobs, they're broke, whatever, and they're dropping now into homelessness. And that's a very disturbing trend. I want to be able to quantify that a little better than we can right now, but just recently at a retreat of our Mahasa members, just last week, I was asking everyone if that had been their experience. Were they seeing that? And to an agency, everybody said yes, they're seeing more and more of that. So even though we know some very great housing programs and how to do housing better, particularly for those with certain disabilities, I'm finding that just the lack of housing is really putting more and more pressure on the system, and I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah. And what is the mission statement?
Well, it's to fight what I just mentioned in some regards. I think,
Right.
People will always, you'll hear this discussion go back and forth sometimes, and people will say, oh, but we've always had poverty, we've always had people who are homeless. That's not exactly true in terms of the phenomenon of how we experience homelessness today. When I was growing up, back in the Berkshires, and 50-some years ago, or if not more, we didn't see shelters. There weren't shelters. There was only one in Boston, really. I mean, sure you would have occasional, transient people or different things, but we didn't have these mass shelters that exist as they exist today. And so I think that while we'll always have a poverty and we always have emergencies, we can change how we deal with that poverty and how we can deal with those emergencies. And we can have a system that's in place that actually alleviates that in better ways. We can have the appropriate amount of housing, for example. One of the things that we have really been encouraging at the Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance recently is the whole concept of developing non-congregate shelters. In other words, a place somebody can go to where they have a door that they can close behind them, their own room, where they can maintain some of the dignity, their dignity and the like. I can remember back in the 90s when we took unaccompanied adults off of VA. A lot of people's problems in an appropriate housing market can be solved with a quick influx of housing dollars to help get them through that rough period. That's far less costly than maintaining a shelter system in which to warehouse that person. So I think that will it end? I'm hoping it does, and that's what our mission is really tied into at Mahasa. It's just to be able to provide provide an alternative to how we deal with poverty. The way I think I can put this best as it relates to our mission is, when I say ending homelessness, I'm not talking about reaching some future utopian state as much as I'm talking about reducing the state's reliance on emergency resources. And instead, let's have the housing system and services in place that can serve people whatever their needs might be.
Okay, great. And does Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance do any type of fundraising?
Oh yeah, we do. Our basic model for operation was, we were created in partnership with public entities, and so today a significant amount of the funding that we do receive are either state or federal dollars that we do receive. And that's been a part of our whole business model almost for years. but it's not sufficient to meet even our needs, and it's not as flexible as having your own private unrestricted dollars. So we have been trying over the last 15 years to slowly but surely keep developing that amount of private fundraising that we're able to do. I think that probably some of our most effective fundraising is that we do a great deal of direct mail appeals that tell Mahasa's story, and to get that out to specific donors. We're trying to build better relationships now with our donors. Of course, always we've been, I think Mahasa from the beginning has always been engaged with securing resources from private foundations that help us. Most often, it's funny, Judy, I think that the private foundations I've had the most success with, I've never even had to contact them. They've contacted us, that they're aware of what we're doing and, invite us to apply for, their particular funds. We had a $1.7 million grant a few years back over a three-year period that came from the United Health Foundation, for example, because they were very interested in some of the work we were doing between community health work and homelessness, people in need, and that type of thing. And so we were able to come up with a very unique program with the Massachusetts Behavioral Health Partnership. So yeah, we have to stay doing that fundraising constantly to keep up.
Yeah, right. And who do you help and how?
Well, I'd like to think that we do help individuals who are experiencing homelessness. Traditionally, although we're thinking of expanding this for certain reasons now, but traditionally we have had our work that's being directed towards the unaccompanied adult person. But we're not, and you and I were talking a little bit about this beforehand, we're not a direct service agency. So the way we help sometimes may seem to be indirect. A person might be getting helped out there and they don't even know the role we had to play in it. Recently, I gotta stop saying here. I don't know why I'm on a role tonight with this, but with the MassCast, I'm sure you're familiar with that. Well, we were helping to fund an entity that was moved about 150 people off of MassCast directly into housing. And we just recently were funded by the state to expand that model to some other parts of Massachusetts. So we're very excited about that. So I like to think we help a lot of these agencies that are so-called members with these things, and that they in turn are helping many, many people that they wouldn't have been able to help had it not been for our innovation and our work. Because again, we're forwarding models that they might never have tried before. The whole concept of Housing First in Massachusetts was introduced by Mahasa at a systemic level for the very first time. And we are the ones who did the cost-benefit analysis that drew the attention of public funding and led to greater and greater public funding over time. We pioneered the whole concept of what we call low-threshold housing, which is non-compliance-based type of housing. It would take a while to explain, but I think you know what I mean, that when we're housing somebody, we're not telling them you can't do this, or this, or you have to do this, or this. We just say, this is your lease, this is the agreement that any other person renting housing would have to do, and that's it. And that's proved to be incredibly successful. Meanwhile, we wrap all of that with services, but we let the person decide what they think they're really going to need, or we build the relationships up to where they can then address what they think they need to address. So in that way, I think that's how we really help a great deal of people. There's been some conversation lately by lots of other groups who've been coming to us about extending some of our innovation side into family housing, particularly with supportive housing for families that are, have a disability somehow tied in with the family. So we're taking a hard look at that now. It'd be a big move for us to go in that direction.
Okay. And what are some incentives focused on ending and preventing homelessness?
Incentives on the part of the state, I think, to change that system. Or are you talking about individuals experiencing homelessness? Which do you mean? Or both?
Both.
Yeah. No, this is the greatest incentive we have to fix homelessness, regardless of whatever else anybody thinks about homelessness. There's a core fact that they have to address, and that's this: if I were walking here, or if I was walking more likely in Boston, and I saw a guy asleep on the library grates or if I saw a guy out stemming or begging change, and I said to myself, oh, it's too bad we don't have the resources or the money to help that person. In truth, that person is already costing you thousands upon thousands of dollars here in Massachusetts. We have universal health insurance, but people are using the healthcare systems, they're using the correction systems, they're using our public safety systems. How many ambulance rides does a guy take? Somebody pays for all that. And usually it's the taxpayer that's paying for that. And what we've been able to demonstrate over the years is that actually solving that person's homelessness dramatically reduces the costs associated with that person. The offset to the healthcare resources alone offsets the housing costs. And that's pretty amazing to think about. To me, it was always seemed like common sense. But, we went out and we've done a lot of the studies to look at it. And, we know from various studies that have been done, both by Tom Byrne from Boston University or by one that was done by Commonwealth Medicine, an analysis group under the funding of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation. Actually, they funded a lot of Tom's work as well. But we found that, it can save, it saves anywhere from $6,000 to $11,000 per person in healthcare costs alone. Pre-housing, from pre-housing, post-housing, it just makes so much sense to end their homelessness. And instead, what do? We continue to serve people through our emergency rooms and private psych hospitals and shelters and all of these emergency things instead of just addressing the core problem. So aside from the moral incentive, for me, there's nothing I find more disturbing than to live in a country where people who might be experiencing a serious mental illness or even people who are struggling with substance use or disorder have to live on our streets. Or that the best that we can do for them is a cot in some large mass shelter. I just feel we can do so much better for that person than what we're presently doing. That's the moral side of it. But even if you don't believe that, there's still an advantage to you as a citizen and as a taxpayer and as someone, trying to build a better community in some way of having that person or those persons housed. I just, it just doesn't make sense to me. People will complain about, they see people out in the street or hanging on the streets. Well, what's the alternative? You can't keep up this practice of let's just put them on a bus to someplace else. That's not working, because everybody else is just shipping others your way. It really doesn't make sense. And I just feel like if we could just, and I'm hopeful for this new administration that's coming in. Not that this past one hasn't done some good things they have, but perhaps they'll take a look at how we produce housing in the Commonwealth and start to target what we really need to solve the problem. But we'll see. But to me, that's incentive enough right there.
Right. Does mental illness have anything to do with homelessness?
Yeah, but it's a very tricky question, and let me phrase this. I'll put it to you this
Okay.
way. Poverty causes homelessness, right? So does mental illness have anything to do with homelessness? Impoverished people who are mentally ill oftentimes are going to wind up the ones being homeless. The people who don't have anybody to fall back on, that don't have family, for example, how many people are the primary caregiver for a person experiencing, really today, in this day, serious mental illness, our immediate family. But if they don't have that backup any longer and they don't have resources, then, there's a high likelihood they're going to wind up experiencing homelessness in some way. The other way I think that it's the relationship between serious mental illness and homelessness is that our primary care systems for serving those experiencing mental illness have failed. They have just failed outright. And while they're good for somebody once they're in a recovery process sometimes, they're not always necessarily as good for somebody while they're actually right in the midst of their illness or experiencing their illness in some way. Again, particularly if they don't have anybody to fall back on. Am I making sense with that? So it's very important that we keep in mind that homelessness isn't caused by mental illness. Impoverished or poor people experiencing mental illness can oftentimes wind up homeless as a result.
Okay.
And so I think that's just an important distinction that we have to make. Of the, we looked at 1,400 separate Medicaid claims data as one of these studies, and over 90% had indicated some were actually diagnosed. This is not us saying, oh yeah, they must be mentally ill. Diagnosed on the claims data as having a mental health issue. And interestingly enough, over half, it was either bipolar or schizophrenia. So again, we know that people can be housed. That's not the problem, you know. But if we have a system that doesn't create that housing, that creates a homelessness problem.
Okay. And Joe, what is chronic homelessness?
Great question. That's a HUD term, Housing and Urban Development, and their funding sources. For the past, going all the way back to the Bush administration, they have prioritized solving chronic homelessness. And a chronic homeless person is someone who's been homeless for over a year, and I think it's for or over 4 times over 2 years, who also has some type of disability, that's life-limiting type of disability, that HUD officially categorizes as a chronic homeless person. I tend to think of it in a different way because I don't think of it necessarily in terms of the time component today. I think about it as any person who is experiencing homelessness, who's serious disability of some type, whether we're talking about serious mental illness, whether we're talking about a substance use disorder, or oftentimes a mix of those two things, or any kind of severe physical disability, that anybody who's homeless and experiencing that has the potential of being what we would call chronic homeless. So, rather than just viewing it from the time frame alone, because oftentimes you'll have guys who've been homeless out there for years that no one has even been keeping track of. They're not on any lists, and yet they could be homeless for 10 years. That person's just as chronic as the guy that you've been able to figure out where he is and long enough to count how long he's been homeless. So I tend to see it more almost from a social diagnostic perspective now that just says, yeah, this guy is, needs help and assistance to move on and to have successful housing and the like.
Okay. And how can we get more housing and shelters for the homeless?
I wish I knew. I think here's the core problem of housing. It is incredibly expensive to build. And it's that incredible expense that really drives up the cost, and that's why we have a lot of housing that's going up. Unfortunately, it's only housing for the affluent and the really well-to-do. It's high-end, what we call high-end housing. There's no financial incentive because no developer can make money off of these other kinds of programs or whatever. So I think that the Commonwealth needs to take a more thought-out approach as to how it might lower costs related to its production of housing. And so, for example, one of the things through this wonderful architect by the name of Mark Margulies, who I've known for 20-something years, has been working on for years, is the whole concept of building housing that's specifically designed for this population, but coming up with a template that can be easily replicated across the state at far lower costs. And one of the ways, by controlling design costs and also by controlling some of the construction costs through shifting away from what's called stick-built out, building housing outside with it, to a modular constructed units, that we've seen that we can, reduce the cost of a unit down. An average unit today might cost you $350,000 to $500,000 per unit. Modular construction, that can be brought down to about $110,000 per unit. Now, if the state were to engage in this, they could set a specific number of designs that could be utilized, and we could build micro housing, micro units that would develop and create a lot more space, not just for homeless people, but for people who are presently at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, who are unaccompanied adults who just need a place to go, need a place to live. And I think it's that kind of thinking that's going to be necessary if we're really going to change our whole idea of this. Currently, the funding that you get available for state housing, it's through these competitive rounds. And it's gauged on the basis of your grant application and all of these other things. And you have to hire architects. Many of them are what we call low-income tax credit deals. That means you got to bring in a whole squadron of lawyers and all of these things. And it just keeps driving the costs up and up and up. And I think that there's got to be a better way of doing it. I just do. And I'd like to say I've convinced more people of it, but unfortunately at the state level, we haven't quite done that. I mean, the real bright spot of this past administration had been the department, EOHHS. And EOHHS, through its Bureau of Substance Abuse, they put aside the housing production. They created more units out there that could come up right away just through their funding of operational dollars and service dollars at the appropriate amounts. And they have been funding that like crazy around the Commonwealth. And as a result, we have far more number of units this year than we had last year. So I think there has to be new models. We have to move off of this old system.
Okay. And what is the Speakers Bureau?
You're smiling, Judy, when you ask that question.
Mm-hmm. It's my passion.
Well, I hope you can share some of that with us today as well. But the Speakers Bureau started back. This is where my memory fails me a little bit. But it started in alliance with the National Coalition for the Homeless, and the whole point of it was people are very aware of the fact that we have lots of homeless agencies and programs and all kinds of things going on addressing the whole so-called issue, around homelessness. But the one group that seldom is allowed to tell their story are the people who are actually experiencing homelessness. And so we were actually funded through National Coalition for the Homeless with a VISTA program where we were working together to develop a model where we just invite people in to come in and tell their story. And of course, some of the folks that come into it are natural born speakers. Others need a little, background, a little bit training. And it's very important that, that we convey to them that this is their story, it's nobody else's story, and we're not coercing anybody on anything. This is just the opportunity for you to be able to get up and tell your story. And what's so amazing about it is that there hasn't been a single thing we've done at Mahasa that has humanized the issue of homelessness as much as the Speakers Bureau has. Because, as you know, there's a great number of people out there who think, this could never happen to me, this is something foreign, this is something other, this must be something that person did to be experiencing homelessness. But when these stories come out, you realize right away that there's almost as many reasons for homelessness as there are persons experiencing homelessness. That everybody's story is so unique. Some people may have lived, just wildest lives whatsoever, and it led eventually to them running out of steam or whatever. But for others, it was like it could have been a whole set of unforeseen circumstances that hit them, and you can find people experiencing homelessness. You will hear profiles in courage that you never hear anywhere else. And what it tells us, right, is that homelessness and people who are experiencing homelessness, it's a heterogeneous population. It's not that you can say, oh, that causes homelessness or this causes homelessness. It's none of those things as much as it is the dynamics of trying to live in the particular world we have right now, and that we're not in control of things sometimes. Things happen and lead us into these circumstances.
Exactly.
But, so I have, and it's very important for us too, and this is something I say, and I think sometimes, you had asked me the fundraising question. We try never to use the Speakers Bureau for fundraising. We don't want them out there telling people our story. We want them out there telling them their story. Because it's not a public relations thing that we do. It's been an empowering thing that we do. And off of it, we've been able to do so many other interesting empowerment kinds of things. Like, we had created the pool of potential board participants people who had experienced homelessness, because that's a requirement under a lot of the federal funding. We did that. We've done advocacy training types of things. We've done all kinds of different things that allow people who've actually experienced homelessness to be able to say what's happening in their lives. That's been particularly important, and seeking people's opinions whenever we're talking about a policy directive or things that we're going in a new direction. We're always now bringing people in to try to get their perspective on it. Everything that led to that was the Speakers Bureau. So it's exciting.
Okay, thank you.
You didn't share your passion with me yet, though. No, it's not.
If anyone would like more info, can you please give us your contact info?
Sure, and I don't know if they're able to put it up on the screen or not, but I'm Joe Finn. And my email is jfinn at MHSA, Massachusetts Housing Shelter Alliance, MHSA.net. And our phone number is 367-6447.
Okay.
And you can reach me on extension 23.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm sorry, but that's all the time that we have.
I've been having so much fun. This is too
Thank
bad.
you for all that you do for those in need. I love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. Please send them to lifeissuestv@gmail.com. And remember, live each day to the fullest and celebrate life.